Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's Sunoikisis class. And today our topic is linked open data. You might have noticed that I am not in my office right now. We are graciously hosted by New College in Oxford, where we are slightly hacking the workshop on linked epigraphy. So the format of today's seminar will be slightly different. We will have an introduction that will be given by Hugh Cayless in a moment. And then we will use 4 representative linked open data projects that we think are particularly interesting and relevant to what we're discussing in our module, and we will use them to highlight one particular topic or issue that is related to linked open data. But now I will literally give my spot to Hugh for the introduction, and I will also start screen sharing. And let's hope that we are actually screen sharing right now. Okay, we are now. And here are Hugh slides.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. And if this is a little weird, I apologize. I found out I was actually doing the introduction about 5 minutes ago. Fortunately, I'd already made the slides for another class. So the main problem that linked open data is for cultural heritage is trying to solve is that we have all of these great cultural heritage web resources, but they tend by themselves to be kind of data silos. So how do we get them to talk to each other? How do we contextualize pieces of information that occur in one place with information from another? And also, how do we keep these things up to date? So how does one site benefit from new or improved information coming from outside? And the ideas behind linked open data are essentially that if you publish your data with an open license, if you use machine-readable formats, even better if you use machine-readable formats that are open, so not just binaries, but actual things that people can easily pick apart and reuse, and then use open web standards to describe your data, and best of all, do all of these things and also link to other people's data. Then you'll have linked open data. You'll have a good architecture for publishing cultural heritage data on the web. And linked data has this kind of tight relationship to something called the semantic web and RDF, and I'm going to make the controversial assertion that you should actually hold off a little bit on that and think about the other stuff first. And the other speakers may disagree with me, which will be cool. So the foundations of linked open data are essentially openness, right? So open licenses. Can people use the data once they've got it? Can they take it and republish it? Can they take it and reuse it, make it better, add more stuff to it, annotate it, and use it for their own purposes? We want to have stable URLs for these things. So can people link to your information and expect that that link will still work in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Open standards. Users need to be able to understand and use the formats that you publish. So if you publish in a what's now a common format, but in 10 years it needs to be migrated to a new one, is that going to be possible? With open standards, at least, all the definitions for your data and how it's formatted will be online and available, and people can use it. and reverse engineer your data. And finally, is your data sort of broken up? Are there URLs for the parts of the data that people are going to be interested in? So can people link into the things that they're going to want to? Is your architecture open, or is everything hidden behind a search interface? So just to unpack these a little bit more, I'll talk about open licensing. You probably have heard about Creative Commons licenses. They're generally great for content, and usually the less restrictive, the better. Obviously, being able to put a license hinges on you actually, or your organization actually owning the copyright on the thing. So you can't license something that you don't own. Possibly, hopefully, what you're using could also be in the public domain, in which case anything goes. You should also think about code, and Creative Commons licenses aren't necessarily great for code. There are other things like the GPL or Apache or MIT licenses that are great for code. And these aren't technological decisions, these are cultural and political decisions to make. So you have to think about, what will the content owner allow you to do? What will your institution allow you to do? And it's worth thinking about that funders nowadays will often insist on open licenses for stuff that you do. Stable URIs. So this is partially a technological question, but also has to do with long-term sustainability and management. So having stable URIs means in order to be able to do this, you have to have control over your web infrastructure. You have to be able to do things like set up redirects from one URI to another. So will your infrastructure permit this? Will your system administrators allow you to do this, or do this for you if you ask them? So this has implications for the management of your technological infrastructure over time. Open standards, we have loads of these things, and they come into play throughout linked open data, starting with the formats for the data and continuing through the protocols and the formats you use to deliver your data. So for formats, you can think about things like TEI for text, or just plain text, or HTML. For images, there's JPEG, TIFF, PNG. For tabular data, there's CSV. Again, open standards are better. For protocols and delivery formats, you think about things like HTTP or HTTPS, which is a protocol for getting stuff on the web. For delivery formats, there's XML. JSON is very popular nowadays. In a lot of ways, these things can be equivalent, but it's important to think about what your audience can work with. And again, it's very important to be open, to be accessible. So are your resources referenceable? And this is really an information design question. What sorts of things do you want to represent in your project? Ideally, everything that you might want to refer to will have its own URL, right? So are you going to be concerned with people, places, documents, other kinds of entities? Could be dates, could be types of material, or types of object. All of these things, if you want them to be citable, all of these things should have their own identifiers, and those should be web identifiers. They should be HTTP or HTTPS URIs. Another question to think about is whether you should use opaque identifiers or not. And this is, by opaque, I mean, does this ID have anything intrinsically to do with the thing that it's referring to, right? So if my my example person/123, that's not the person's name, obviously, or anything like that. I could use a person's name, but there might be problems with doing that. It's often better to use an opaque identifier than not, because your ID is not pegged to the referent of that thing. So if you found, for example, that person 123 had multiple names, it's very easy with that identifier just to add more name information. But if the name is actually in the URI, then you're possibly implying that one name is better than another, and maybe you don't mean to. So wanted to try and give a kind of recipe for usable linked open data. I would start by getting my data in good shape, right? Do I have all the metadata I need? Is it properly licensed? Will it be updated in an ongoing way? Do I need to version it if it's being updated? So do I need to use version control and keep track of how it's been updated and by whom and when? Second, I would think about how people will get and use that data. Do they want to be able to download it in big chunks, right? Do I just want to be able to get all of the data on your site? You probably don't want to allow that to happen via a query interface, because it will be kind of expensive. You probably want to just export all the data and let people download it in that case. Do people want to be able to get it in big chunks, or do they want to be able to get individual records and documents? Both. That's a question you have to think about. How will users get around in your data space? So are they going to use? Are they going to follow links? Are they going to primarily do searches? What sorts of links will you have, right? And this gets, again, back to what kinds of entities do you deal with? If you've got these kinds of questions all sorted out, so if you've dealt with all of this stuff, now you can start to think about semantic web stuff. So what kind of types of links will you have? What contextual information do you want to provide using semantic web technologies? So now I'll get to talking about RDF a little bit. Just a quick introduction. RDF represents data using facts. So this is basically lists of statements which can link together. And a statement is a tripartite object. You can think of it as subject, predicate, and object. They're called triples. And the subject and predicate in this case are always URIs, and the object may be a URI or what's called a literal. That's a piece of data, a number, a string, or it could be an XML document or something like that. So here's an example from papyri.info. So this is saying that this document's XML source is part of this collection. So BGU12, the document, is part of BGU Volume 1. So that's kind of straightforward, right? It's just a fact, and it's a simple statement. What you can do, though, is you can link these things together. RDF forms a graph, or kind of you can think of these as chains of statements. So BGU12 source is part of BGU1. BGU12, the web page, is has a topic BGU12 source, that is the XML document. So the BGU12 source URI is being used in both of these statements. It's the subject of one and it's the object of another. So these things kind of chain together. So this is forming what's called a directed graph. This is why people talk about putting stuff into the graph of cultural heritage data. So because we're using web URLs as names for the bits of information in this graph, we can actually say useful things about our web resources in a machine-readable way using RDF. And the thing to realize about it is it's all triples all the way down. We can use existing facts to produce new facts, for example. So if A is related to B and B is related to C, then A is also related to C. And in fact, this is what papyri.info does. There's kind of sparse relationships in the data sources that go into making it up. But because we have that sparse information, we can actually fill it out using exactly these kinds of inferences. So we know that document A is related to document C because we have these other relationships that we can use. RDF uses schemas or ontologies to define the properties, that is, the predicates that it uses. And these are just more sets of triples again. And it's kind of, this is useful because, partly because you can then query it. There are RDF databases, and there's a language called Sparkle, which allows you to search RDF databases in exactly the same sort of way that SQL lets you get information out of a relational database. So you can form a query that will actually give you new information out of the data that you've put into your data set. And there's all kinds of weirdnesses. I'll skim over some of these things. There are some complications to using RDF. Partly, so part of the problem can be deciding just what RDF vocabulary do I want to use, and there are lots of them, and they don't always mesh very well together. So it can be a decision: do you want to make all your investment in one particular vocabulary? Do you want to make up your own? Do you want to pick and choose from different bits? There's also a problem with, how do I know things about my facts? That can be an issue. So yeah, RDF, for example, how do I talk about things that aren't on the web then? If linked open data is all about using HTTP URLs to identify things, what if I want to talk about a real person? So there are various strategies you can use, and some of them are linked here. It may not actually be a problem. You're not probably actually going to confuse a real person with a web page about that person. But it can get tricky when you're talking about documents. So papyri.info has editions online, and those editions have URIs. So you can't. You can get yourself tied in knots sometimes if you're talking about, am I talking about the papyrus itself, or am I talking about the edition of the papyrus online? This is confusing, and people tend not to care about it, which can be part of the problem. What RDF ontologies do you use? It can be tricky. So there are things like CLOG Theorem, which is sort of one ontology to rule them all. A lot of people do sort of mix and match, and you might decide you're just going to make up your own, but you want to be a little bit careful doing that. And finally, and this can be a real sticking point, triples don't themselves have context. So if I care about where a particular fact comes from, my RDF might not tell me that. So RDF by itself isn't necessarily enough. There are strategies for mitigating this purely in the RDF space, but honestly, my opinion is you shouldn't rely on RDF to do that sort of a thing. It's just not a good universal data format. You should use, for contextual information, you should use stuff that you can annotate in version, like TEI, for example, and not attempt to put absolutely all your information into the graph. And just to sort of try and tie things up before we move on, if we cooperate and use the same URIs for things that we talk about, so places, people, things like that, then we have a way to discover and connect contextual information about our resources coming from other projects. Also, following linked open data principles just makes for good open web architecture. So just doing it by itself makes our sites more easily discoverable, more easy to navigate. Using cool URIs for our resources makes for good long-term sustainability. I just say be a little bit cagey about the semantic web stuff. It's a powerful tool, but it can be a rabbit hole. And you don't want to spend all of your time trying to figure out how to get your stuff in RDF. So, who's next?
Thank you very much, Hugh, for a great critical introduction to linked open data and RDF. I think that our next speaker should be Andrew Meadows, and I think you shared the document with me.
I have. If you want to share that on, it's just got some links in it.
On what platform? Sorry.
It's a Google Doc I've shared.
Maybe on my other address. You emailed my.
SAS account.
Okay. Ha.
Sorry,
No, that was perfectly reasonable. I just closed it. And, okay, there it is. Okay, Andy will talk about Nomisma, which is one of the seminal projects in linked open data for classics and cultural heritage. Giving him the chair, and would you do the screen share yourself?
Can you?
You just click here, so people also can see your face briefly, if you like. And then you can,
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm now going to talk a little bit about one instance of the application of linked open data to a specific discipline, and I am just going to launch onto the web. Desktop there.
And confirm.
Share. Okay, and where's my browser? So the first thing is there is a document there with a lot of links to various projects for anyone who wants to go away and explore later at this sort of world that linked open data has made possible in numismatics. And it has made that possible, or we've made that possible by the creation of a resource called Nomisma, which is nomisma.org. Hugh mentioned the possibility that if you're going to move into the world of linked open data, you can either go out and look for vocabularies and ontologies that can express the ideas you want to express. And hopefully, if you're lucky, there may be things out there that are suitable. Quite often, there won't be. When we began this project, and this is really is a communal project now, there are a significant number of us you can see there on the screen who are involved in steering this. When we began this about 8 years ago, we decided that we probably needed our own set of vocabularies and an ontology so that we could, within the numismatic field, express our ideas the way we wanted to, unambiguously using numismatic terms. Now, this was a fairly bold and frankly rather overweening, you might say, undertaking, but it seems to have taken root. There are now is now quite an ecosystem of projects using Nomisma, either IDs or indeed with a full RDF version using the ontology as well. So I'm just going to talk briefly through one or two of these ideas and then take a quick look at the ontology to show you the sorts of things we have there and we've created so that we can begin to make these RDF expressions, these subjects, predicates, and objects. So for subjects and objects, we need IDs, and we can simply browse those by searching here. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cheat and just type one in to begin with. And you'll notice that one of the things, this keyboard is...
Sorry, it's Italian.
It's Italian. There it is. It's an Italian keyboard. We've tried to make the URIs as clean and as intuitive as possible. So nomisma.org/ID/ followed by Athens will take you to the URI for the Mint of Athens. We created a Mint of Athens. You might ask, well, why would you do that? Surely there are other IDs for Athens out there that are usable. Well, for us, we were concerned specifically, and as it says here, NMO Mint, we're talking about the Mint of Athens rather than the place of Athens. This is something that's very specific to numismatics, and it is a different concept from the city. But we do want to be good web citizens, so we want to be able to express relationships from our data to other people's data. And so we do give as many other IDs for Athens and say that these are close matches in the Scos vocabulary. So you can find the Pleiades URI for that. So there we have an unambiguous way of talking about the Mint of Athens, and we can dump that into a triple. And there are now enough projects out there doing that Nomisma is actually able to ingest back some data. And the map you see here for Athens looks rather dull if we just show it like that. But if I click,
could you zoom in slightly?
Can I zoom in?
People to see what's going on YouTube.
Yeah. So there. Whoops. Everything's zooming. Here is the map that appears on the Nomisma page if you choose to highlight hordes, and these are groups of coins found together. So what we could do very quickly and very powerfully is begin to express relationships between different things in this linked data world. And it's doing that because we've created another resource, which I will open, that describes the hordes of coins with stable URIs and talks about their contents in ways that we can get at through linked open data. I'm going to shrink that down again, just because we might be interested not just in places, but people. We can do this also with the people of the ancient world. If I want to find all the people who produced coinage in Athens, I can do that. And here is a list of people who produced coinage in Athens. I can click on one of these. We can get his ID, and that's not a good example. I'm going to find one with a full name. Here is Nikagoras, produced coins in 134133, and we can express the identity of this guy with somebody who's listed in the lexicon of Greek personal names using that URI. So we are linking from our own little numismatic silo out into the broader world. Within our own little numismatic silo, what we also do, in addition to creating IDs for the things we want to talk about, is we create IDs for the relationships. So things that we want to be able to say about a coin that it has a denomination. Nobody else but a numismatist is interested in that sort of concept. So we create it in our numismatic ontology, and it is there for the numismatic community to use. Very quickly, I will try and show you one or two other projects that now use the Nomisma IDs and ontology to be able to serve up large quantities of linked data about coins. And one project is this one, Ochre, which is online coins of the Roman Empire. It is a complete typology. It lists every single known variety of Roman imperial coinage. There are 42,748 of those. And because it provides, and you can, if I click on just the first of these, this project provides a stable URI, which you can see up here. I don't know whether I can make that any larger. I don't seem to be able to. For this particular type of coin, and because different collections are now using that URI to catalog their own coins, we begin to be able to amalgamate lots of examples of these sorts of coins from different collections. This one is in Germany. This one's in New York. These are in Berlin. This one's in Cambridge. This one's at the British Museum in London. So we have now about 31 different projects or collections now contributing data. And just by the simple use of these stable URIs, we're able to begin to amalgamate stuff. And we can also, in the same way, link that in to other resources such as Hoard databases. I'll just pick one example here, and hopefully we can see there are a couple of provenances for this type appearing. So by using a standardized scheme of URIs within the discipline of numismatics, we've made it possible for this project to link to other projects and pull together data in ways that otherwise required large numbers of indices and volumes on the shelf. I've clicked through from the online Coins of the Roman Empire website now to something called Coin Hoards of the Roman Republic Online, which is a database that was created by Chris Locke here in London and is now online with stable URIs for the hoards and describes their contents using the stable URIs for Roman Republican and Roman Imperial coinage. If I click on an RRC number, we're now linking through to yet another resource, Coin Hoards of the Roman Republic Online, which is providing information on this particular coin type and lots 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 of specimens, as well as a nice map of find spots, which we can scroll through on a timeline. The final thing I will just draw attention to also, if we go back to online Coins of the Roman Empire, is the advantage that we get from using this sort of approach in terms of multilingualism. The original books on which this project was based were all published in English. There are 10 volumes of them. They're hugely expensive. Very few people have them themselves. They're in specialist libraries only. By bringing this to the web, we've obviously made it online to everybody, but we've also taken the opportunity to translate the whole thing into about 15 different languages. We're trying to cover all the source countries for the Roman Empire, as it were, so that people out there can find a coin type and can catalog it according to this system in their own language, but can still contribute the data because they're using the URIs to a project like this. So hopefully we open up new horizons by doing that. So that's a very brief overview of what we're doing in numismatics. Work is now going on seriously in the Greek world, and within the next 10 to 15 years, I hope to be able to give you a demonstration of that working for every single mint that ever produced a coin in the ancient world. We're certainly on our way. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We also, Pelagios, are very, very grateful to the work that Numisma has done. And our next speaker is Gabriel Bodard, that is going to talk about Snap, and he'll tell us all about it. That's over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Valeria. So before I start, I want to make one small setting change to the Hangout. So bear with me for just a second. This should improve the view for people watching on YouTube. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about linked open data for aggregating multiple data sources for people from the ancient world. Let me just screen share. Where are my slides, Valeria? Do you have them on here somewhere? Great.
No, these are the ones.
Okay. Starting from here. Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, so talking about linking person data. So the Snapdragon project started as an attempt to link together person data from all these different existing digital sources of person data. Not all by any means prosopographical projects, but other kinds of catalogs, onomastic data, etc. And there are obviously thousands of different prosopographies and other person databases of one kind or another for the ancient world. Not by any means all, but a significant number of which are in digital form in one way or another, very few of which have all of the criteria needed for linked open data, stable URIs, and all that sort of thing. Slightly more now, but very few when we started. So what we hoped to produce by this were several benefits, but among them, this is number 3 on this list, is the production of a research tool in the form of this annotation graph, in the form of this network of ancient people linked to one another via various kinds of connections between the databases in which they're recorded. This Snapdragon started out with a pilot project in 2014 and 15, and that's where it is now, is where it was at the end of 2015, because the hazards of fixed-term funding. So we have a pilot project which has incorporated the lexicon Greek personal names up to as much as had been digitized at the time, Trismegistos, as much as the person information was available at the time, and the Prosopographia Imperii Romani, ditto, and a couple of other smaller data sets, such as the person catalogue of the British Museum and about 1,000 persons from the integrated library catalogue, VIAF, into the beginnings of a catalogue of ancient persons. The problems that Snapdragon was attempting to solve by creating this this linked data set were summarized in these 5 goals, as we saw it. These are 5 things which we wanted to enable people to do, or rather which people would need to do in order for person data, prosopographical data, to be available online and integrated. And the first was simply to put person data online and make sure that each individual person had stable URIs. Again, this wasn't something we could do for them, but it's something that useful to tell people: if you're putting your person data online, make sure these following minimum criteria are met, and then we'll be able to work with it. The second step is the one I'll talk more about in a moment, is contributing then person data, a subset of person data from any given data set to the Snapdragon graph. And then on top of that, we wanted to be able to identify explicit co-references between databases. So if a particular person who is known from a particular source appears in 2 different databases, and there's absolutely unambiguously the same person from the same sources, we can simply link those and create a single identifier for those rather than have 2 separate identifiers for them. Then there's the more complex assertions where one scholar might say, I think this person on this inscription and this person on this coin are the same person, but it's not an explicit co-reference. This is something where you need, in as well as to be able to express the relationship, to be able to express who claims that relationship, possibly who else disagrees, and what reasoning there might be behind it, and so forth. And this is something much more complex. We haven't spec'd exactly how that would be expressed in RDF yet. As I believe we were saying at the time, a signal of how difficult a problem this is that we tasked Hugh Cayless was trying to fix it. That's just so that's full of future. And then the fifth thing we wanted to enable people to do is to be able to annotate their text, external text, with person identifiers to disambiguate those references. And I won't say anything more about that, because what we're going to do with that is entirely to emulate what Pelagios have done, and Valeria is going to talk about Pelagios in a minute. So going back to point 2 then, contributing person data to Snapdragon, what we really want people to do is to contribute this very small subset of 9 types of information to Snapdragon. In fact, only the first 4 of those are required, and those are very technical things. We need a URI, we need this identifier. We need to know by type, we mean that this is a person. Or it might be something else person-like. It might be a deity, it might be a group, it might be an animal, but something that can appear in a person list or a prosopography. We need some kind of a citation, the explicit citation, how you would identify this person within a particular source, collection, database, prosopography, etc. And we need to know what that collection is, what the publisher is, what the database it is that it is coming from. This is the bare minimum we need to be able to get. The reason these are the only required things is that the simplest kind of data set that we might integrate, such as a library catalog record, might only have these pieces of information. Other things that we very much want, if they're available, are name, and the only reason name is recommended, not required, is that many prosopographies include large numbers of anonymous persons, and attestation. So we want to know what are the primary texts that tell us this person exists. Other disambiguating information would be nice if you have it, such as the date, such as any geographical associations, such as titulature, any other kind of information that we might have about the person. That would be really useful to help people to disambiguate between the 950 different people called Alexander in a particular prosopography. Relationships with other people are also very useful to know. It really helps to disambiguate a person if it is so-and-so daughter of someone else. And other identifiers, this is really useful, just being able to, if you know that this person appears in other prosopographies, other library catalogs, other online sources, give us those identifiers. Web identifiers if possible. I mean, if you have the Wikipedia URI for a particular person, that's great. If not, just giving their PIR number or their number in a particular prosopography. It also helps us then to disambiguate between different persons that turn up in our data. So as I say, what we have is basically a pilot of this. For each person, we have somewhere just over 650,000 person records in the Snapdragon dataset. Their records look something like this. This is a HTML view of the RDF, of course, rather than the RDF itself, but it gives us something like this, tells us something about the person, their identifiers, their name, associated information. These are the disambiguators, the attestations of them, relationships, and so forth. The status, as I said, of this is incomplete. We have these person pages of the kind I just showed. We have the 5 data sets that we've integrated so far. There's a Sparkle endpoint. Hugh mentioned this language for querying linked data. This is a really powerful and useful language and method for querying this data, and having a Sparkle endpoint is absolutely crucial for being able to query linked open data. But if a Sparkle endpoint is the only way to query your data, it's completely useless to scholars, to historians, because no one wants to go out there and use Sparkle to query this data. What we really need, and what we don't have yet, is a human readable search interface over the top of that. So that's just as a way of a caveat, as it were, for the incomplete status of the project at the moment. So I'll stop there, and I'll pass back to Valeria, who I think is speaking next. Anyway.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Gabby. Are we still screen sharing? Yes. Okay, what I want to talk about is not much Pelagius, because we really have talked a lot about that already, but using Pelagius as an example of an approach to linked open data for cultural heritage, which is what is called, let's say, a lightweight approach to linked open data. And just to link briefly with what Hugh was saying before about ontologies and these RDF triples, they are, let's say, complicated in a way. Well, first of all, it is a very challenging task to basically reduce very complex information in, sentences that have 3 words, in those that Hugh has called triples. So how do we do that? And how do we express, for example, things like ambiguity or uncertainty or fuzziness in these very, very simple and basic sentences? How do we categorize them? What are the properties that we use, and so on? But also, even before we start asking ourselves this question, the point is how much information we want to try to express. And really, there is no a right answer to this, because for some projects it might be better to stay simple. For some other projects it might be better and more effective to be actually very, very, very detailed. And there is, I think, the danger of wanting to be very, very, very detailed sometimes. But I just want to present to you both these approaches. And the first one, let's say the simplest choice you can do for expressing information linked open data is what is called the open annotation format, which is what Pelagius uses as well. And it basically just says that there is a relationship between 2 things, 2 entities, and one is called the body and one is called the target, and they are joined, they are linked together by what you're saying about it, by your statement, by your annotation. And just to maybe refer to something that we are visually more familiar with, because we have used Recogito a lot during this seminar. So this part here is the body, and the word that you have highlighted is your target. So you're saying that the place Thebe, as it is expressed in Pleiades with that URI, is the body of your annotation, and it goes to connect to the word Thebes in your text, that is the target of your text. Now, this kind of annotations are very easy to create, but of course they also have some drawbacks. We'll compare them to, let's say, the opposite end of the spectrum of complexity. What Hugh said is the ontology to rule them all is the CLOG Theorem, which was born in a museum context. So it was specifically born to describe cultural heritage artifacts and to give as much information as possible about them. But it has grown and grown and grown to include pretty much everything in and outside the word. And if you look at the CLOG Theorem documentation, it is actually very long. It's several pages long. You can click on that link in the slides. It's a PDF. I think it's something like 46 pages long or something like that. But don't take my word for it. Just open it and go through it and see how many relationships, how many different properties, classes, categories there are. It is truly, it is an achievement. It is a remarkable piece of scholarship. It really took a lot of work coordinating various expert communities to put together, all this ontological work. And just to give you another example, is this, okay, no, I think I can show you online. Okay, just to give you an example, this is on the British Museum online catalog, and this is the description in RDF in triples statements using the CLOG Theorem of one single object, which is the Rosetta Stone. And I think it's quite interesting to have an idea of how would you describe such a complex and interesting object like the Rosetta Stone with RDF statements, but you can see that it's 11 pages long. So it is a very complex and thorough description of the Rosetta Stone. Now, as we were saying, there is no right choice. There is no one approach that is better than the other. Let's say that the lightweight approach is very easy to learn and may be easier to approach for a non-expert audience. So it may be easier for you to convince people that don't have a great, a solid IT background to give it a try and produce this kind of annotation. It is also easier if you want to join and link together different databases. Let's say it's quite intuitive. The simpler is the thing that you're saying, the easier it is to establish connections with different databases that might have used slightly different, domain and things like that. But on the other hand, you're not saying much about that connection. You're just saying there is a connection. Even if we think of peripleo that we have also used, for example, if we find a connection between a place and an artifact, we don't really know what is the real nature of that connection. It is a find spot. It is the place that is mentioned, maybe in an epigraphy or a coin. Is it the place where the object is it now because it is part of a museum collection? We don't know. But this kind of RDF statement highlights a connection that then is up to us to investigate further if that is what we want to do. So, I mean, some people find this kind of connections not informative enough, a little bit too opaque. But personally, I think they are already very good at identifying, for example, trends and, let's say, more of a bigger picture. The heavyweight approach, which is the one of the CLOG Theorem that we have seen, really requires a lot of time to learn and to become proficient in. There is a little bit of redundancy built in it. They should be avoided. It does take an effort to become, really expert in that language. Also, because it is so rich and it is so complex, it may become maybe less easy to join different projects that have talked about different aspects of things. But on the other end, it is a standard, which is a great pro. We were talking about, the importance of using standards, and the CLOG Theorem, it's an ISO standard. So as a matter of sustainability, it is definitely a plus. And it also allows you to theoretically to perform very, very precise query. Although, as Gabby said, that still needs a little bit of Sparkle language to perform that. I think that I will stop now. This is what I wanted to tell you about the lightweight or the heavyweight approach. And I will now ask Tom Elliott, that you might have heard of when we were talking about Play This Gazetteer, that is going to present the work that we were doing here today. And
hi. So, are we still sharing the screen?
No, not anymore.
No, we're not.
Do you want to share your screen?
I think I'll share it toward the end because I just have a few references that will come up in my talk. Although you've dealt with a couple of them, so thank you. It's my brief today to talk a little bit about ongoing discussions that were the purpose of this meeting here in Oxford around the question of how do we do this linked data thing with epigraphy and what that means and why we'd be doing it. I suppose that one thing I should do is briefly define what is epigraphy. Generally speaking, epigraphy is a scholarly study of texts that are written on durable materials like metal and stone. They can be monumental, that is to say built on some kind of a structure that's either for the purpose of displaying the inscription or as part of a larger thing. They can be on portable objects, and they can also be inscribed in certain contexts into rock that is still part of its geological presentation. Many cultures have used epigraphy in the past and in the present for a wide variety of purposes, whether it's record keeping or for governance, administration, and propaganda, that sort of thing. Religious inscriptions are common, and funerary inscriptions are very common and should be familiar to most of us. Around the scholarly practice of epigraphy, there's an established historiographical tradition and modes of scholarly publishing that go back arguably at least to the 19th century, but with antecedents before, some of which can be found in the cultural reception of older epigraphies by more contemporary cultures, whether we're talking about European continent, or whether we're talking about China or some other places where epigraphy has been used and reused throughout time. The digital approach to epigraphical publication and epigraphical data sharing has various antecedents, but at least for Greek and Latin epigraphy, the work really quickened in the latter part of the 1990s and continues to this day as a international and interdisciplinary concern. This particular event is a two-day workshop that's hosted here at New College, Oxford, by Andrew Meadows, who's a tutor and professor in ancient history in the college, and Jonathan Prag, who's a tutor and associate professor in ancient history at Merton College. And so we're grateful to them as our hosts. The participants, most of whom don't probably fall into one or more, usually more, of the following categories: epigraphists, historians, technologists, digital humanists, classicists, and are here representing many key approaches and projects in the digital study and publication of inscriptions, particularly in the Greek and Latin world. I'd like to spend the sort of balance of my time talking a little bit about the current state of data, what we're actually trying to do in this room today and tomorrow, as we look at the question of how do linked data and epigraphy come together and when. The first is to talk a little bit about the current state of digital data for epigraphy. Most digital information for epigraphy resides in one of two kinds of forms. It either resides in a database, a relational database of some kind, or in XML files, the extensible markup language, using the text encoding initiative tag set and conforming to a specification for that was developed beginning in the 1990s called EpiDoc, which stands for epigraphic documents, as you might imagine. There are a number of websites and resources for ancient history, or for inscriptions, that make use of hybrids of these two technologies for various reasons. There's also quite a lot of digital imagery around that is related to the textual and structured data material in various sorts of ways. And of course, we still have a great dependency on print. There's archival materials that are still important to the study of epigraphy, and these can include not only the inscriptions themselves, but impressions of them, drawings, ink transfers, rubbings, various kinds of secondary exemplars of epigraphy. The databases in the XML respond in many ways to the established scholarly historiographical practice. And so they will tend to contain information about the text and information about the text-bearing object. Each project will, of course, have made various decisions about what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize, what to not bother to collect, because they're all created for one or another research purpose. But the kinds of things you could expect to find out about the text would include the language, the script that text is written in, perhaps the mode of inscription. Is it chiseled into the stone, or has it been cast in bronze? What are the letter forms? What are the letter sizes? The text itself, its words, perhaps a translation into one or more modern languages, usually some number of editorial interventions in the text in order to correct perceived mistakes on the part of the original inscriber, or supplements to deal with various kinds of problems of preservation or interpretation. You'll often want to keep track of or highlight the persons that are mentioned, the places that are mentioned, and these often make reference both in print and increasingly in digital form to standard collections or reference works that provide the known attestations of these individuals or these places and so on. Similarly, administrative offices, military units, and various kinds of technical terms may be treated especially or somehow marked so that they are indexable, so that they might be searchable, or at least highlighted for the user. Measurements of the text-bearing object, the kind of material of which it consists, its presumed original location, its place of finding, all these sorts of indicia are also of interest and are often captured in these sort of systems. As we start to think about moving toward linked data, we want to be able to have not just identifiers for the text-bearing object, for the text, for the people, for the places, but we also want to have common vocabularies, collections of verbs that we all agree on their meaning, with which to construct these three-part sentences that are the triples that make up RDF. And there has been past work here. The Electronic Archive of Greek and Latin Epigraphy, which has been a consortium of database projects that has been around since the late 90s, standardized and produced multilingual versions of many lists of possible values for some of these categories. For example, for the material on which an object is made, or the class of inscription. Is it funerary? Is it administrative? And these sort of vocabularies form one of the things that we're concerned about exploiting and making fit for the purpose of sharing information online. There have also been a number of attempts to explore the use of the CLOG Theorem, which Valeria talked about a moment ago, for describing some aspects of epigraphic materials and the supports, the physical objects on which they are transmitted to us. Some of those have seen publications, some of those have only sort of made their way into conference presentations. And there are other exploratory projects that are being started now that make use of other approaches rather than the CLOG Theorem approach. What we've done so far here in Oxford is mainly to focus on bashing out for ourselves a description of the kinds of users and the uses that linked data and epigraphy might be put to. We can always build lots of castles in the air, great elaborate technical infrastructures that do all sorts of things, but without a clear focus on who we're building them for and what their first and eventual concerns are, what work they want to do with the digital systems. We don't have, that's our guiding star. That's what we need. So, so far we've sort of elaborated stories about students completing assignments or doing research projects, museum and archaeological site visitors who might encounter actual inscriptions and want to contextualize them for themselves or explore them further. Epigraphic researchers who are preparing editions of new texts or who are engaged in study around the epigraphy, and so they're concerned with comparative and contrasting objects or texts or terminology. Scholars in a wide variety of allied fields, either contemporaneous to the epigraphy or looking at it from a comparative or connective issue from across cultures, across time periods, who are always interested in more evidence, more comparenda. And we've also talked about how projects that do these kind of general reference works, so whether it's a gazetteer for locations or whether it's a collection of prosopographical or onomastic information, that is to say about historical persons or naming practices, how they might make use of linked epigraphic data to either speed up their analytical or collecting process, or to actually do new kinds of studies that aren't possible without a digital component. So tomorrow, I think the group is considering exactly what topic we should wrestle with tomorrow, because we think this is just the beginning of a discussion that will range across conferences and meetings and projects for some time to come. But hopefully we'll come out of this meeting tomorrow with some first steps that will be of interest to anyone who's been interested in what I've had to say here. And with that, I think I'll turn things back over to the organizers of this session.
Thank you very much, Tom, and all the speakers that have, agreed to this unconventional class. We have a little time for questions, although I'm not entirely sure how to. I will manage the questions. Maybe we could start with the room. Does anyone have any question for the speakers or for each other? The workshop has really,
they're tired. Yes.
Has really hit them hard. Okay. Then I'll just. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if any of the people who presented either theory or case studies could comment on what we think the tooling requirements might be to go from having some good linked data around our ancient materials to that being useful and usable by. Let's be naive and assume we know who our audience is and it's the experts in the data we're publishing. To keep it simple, what are the tooling implications? Several people have said we can't just take linked data and assume people will look at it and know what it means. Right? We have to get it from there to something else. Where are we trying to get it and how do we get it?
I think the supposition of at least some in the room is that there's going to have to be a combination of recommended practices for preparing the linked data, either moving from sort of these semi-standard database structures that we tend to see, or from the Epidoc to a set of linked data triples that correspond and make use of certain vocabularies that we agree on. But then there's going to have to be some ecosystem or constellation of services and brokers who are making sure that this stuff is getting indexed and shared around and turned into other products that are consumable and reusable, so that there's an environment that lets you pick up someone else's edition and use it as a starting point for your own modified edition. There's various kinds of exploratory and discovery tools that would let you range across the material in various ways. Beyond that, I think personally, I'm not sure what comes first. I think we need to look at these users and what their immediate needs are and see where the low-hanging fruit is, and at least create some reference implementations that do things. So
just retrospectively, I've been told that people couldn't hear Gabby's question, so I'll summarize. And it was, if I capture it correctly, how do we go from having linked open data, working linked open data, and actually people using linked open data? What is the step in between? And especially tool side, what is the step in between?
I think my answer would be mostly people won't know they're using it. There will just be, it will manifest itself in the fact that different projects link to each other, so that if you're looking, for example, at a Pleiades place, you can find out what coins are related to this place. You can find out what documents are related to this place. That's because of Pelagios, and it's because there's a linked data ecosystem behind it, but a user's not going to be seeing any of that. It's all happening behind the scenes. So, yeah, I mean, there's kind of theoretical ways in which an individual might exploit linked open data, but it's mostly a matter of project interoperation, I think. It's not something a user will really encounter most of the time, at least at this stage.
Anyone else wants to comment on this or ask another question? Putting pressure on each of you with the camera. Yeah, okay. So thank you again to all the people that were in the room for their patience and their contributions, and for the people that are looking at this because they're taking the module. Look at the exercises. There are 2 this time, but just because the first is very, very simple, it's just about using a little bit of some of the projects that we've talked about, and just, you know, have a go and perform some searches. That's just a warming up. And then you will see there is another exercise that is more about using RDF to describe something. You'll find more details in the page. If there are not questions from the people that are also joining the Hangout, I will just, no, there don't seem to be. I will just say thank you again to everyone and see you next week. Goodbye.